Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Zymposium. We're continuing our series on building better open source. And again, I am joined by Tushar, who is one of the lead open source developers of the Tail Call project. And Tushar, you want to give your one sentence pitch for Tail Call? You've got plenty of practice doing that by this point.
Okay. So when you're building APIs, typically you have this whole notion in mind, especially as a platform engineer, that I want to build the most pristine, the most generic API possible that serves most of the use cases. But what happens eventually when you're building a front end as a front end engineer, you need very specialized APIs. You need a lot of data. You want to be able to get user, their posts, their transactions, everything on the if you're building a rich user interface, you need a lot of data on the front end. So there's often a mismatch between what you need on the front end versus what is available in one single API on the back end. And typically it's sort of, and this gap is sort of solved by doing a lot of orchestration logic, putting a lot of orchestration logic on your, typically the front end layer. Tail call sort of bridges that gap. It says, write your APIs the way you want to, express them using the tail call DSL as a graph, and eventually a client can query this, query the backend the way they want to. You don't have to continuously keep making customized APIs for every front-end use case. That's the pitch.
That's the elevator pitch for a skyscraper that's 40 stories high. No, that's good. Thank you for that. All right, fantastic. So in our first session, we basically talked about the personas, I think, and we got those personas nailed down pretty good. And then in our last session, we did a little bit more of that, but also we took a look at the existing homepage and we collected a lot of the features that are important to the product. And then also we took a look at competition. And in particular, we were looking at how they're positioning themselves in the space. And we also looked at adjacent solutions like API gateways. How are they similar to Tail Call? How are they different than Tail Call? And I feel like after that conversation, I have a much better feeling of who this open source project is targeting, the pains that it's targeting, and how it relates to existing solutions in the space. So I think one of the big unsolved questions we have to provide an answer to in this session is, are we still targeting front-end engineers, or did looking at some of the competitive positioning marketing material, did that influence us to shift gears and target the back-end engineer? What are your thoughts after thinking about this for the past week?
So the first discussion that we had, the first call where we discussed positioning, using first principles, it seems like front-end is the obvious choice, right? But when you look at competition, it's backend. They're trying to position product around backend. And we sort of, in the beginning, sort of positioned it in the backend. You can see in the choice of words, right? You talk about scale, front-end team doesn't care about scale. They're just running that piece of software on one device. We're talking about APIs, orchestrations, data access layers, not something that front-end teams kind of deal with on a daily basis. So in a way, we're still inclined towards backend already. But I'm fairly unsure about this. If we solve this, then we wouldn't need these 3 calls. Had we figured it out in the first call, we wouldn't need this. So
I think that's a good point. And I think that's a good lesson for all the open source contributors who are watching this, is that sometimes you don't know how to, you came up with something really new and crazy and you built it to solve your own problem, but you don't necessarily know. I mean, you know that you're a potential user for your own product, but you don't know what a representative user out there is. And where do they come from? Do they come from big companies, small companies, big teams, small teams, new projects, old legacy projects, front end, back end, full stack? What's going to be the major adopter of your solution? And I think in the case of a solution like this, which could be used both by front end and back end engineers, and maybe a little bit by full stack, but mostly front end and back end engineers, and also relates to stuff ops is doing. It's a complicated story. And I think one of the things that I've done a lot is iterate and see what works. Iterate and see what works. And unfortunately, websites can only give you feedback on traffic and like who's visiting your site and what they're clicking and where they're coming from and stuff like that. If you've integrated this into some sort of analytics solution, they don't give you information that's even more valuable, which is it's that experience of trying to describe your solution to someone in real time and looking at their expression on their face and also the types of questions that they have and seeing in that moment their confusion and also seeing once they understand what it is this something they want or is it something they're ambivalent about, they really don't care about? And that's where I think personally there's tremendous value in going to conferences, in going to events and meetups, meeting with people, different types of people, and pitching them again and again and again and again, and learning from that real time sort of cycle of feedback. Is this landing with this person? Do I need to tweak it? And I'll give you examples. The pitch for Golem Cloud, which I'm still not 100% happy with, I probably tried pitching at 100 different ways to more than 100 people. And every time I pitch it, I learn something new. Either that's not working, I'm using the wrong terminology, or I'm pitching to someone who doesn't really care. And that's either I'm pitching to the wrong person or I've pitched it in a bad way, and I can't decide between them sometimes. So I think that's one of the things that every open source contributor, if they're really trying to get their messaging dialed in, needs to do is pitch to real people in sort of real time scenarios where you get that instant feedback. I think we're also going to know to some extent, based on the success of the website, is the website, because the website is top of the funnel for tail call. This is where a lot of people will learn about, probably it's either this or the GitHub page, but the GitHub page may be derived from this. So it's going to be, it's way up there. This is where a lot of people are going to learn, and it will trickle into your subsequent call to action, which is get started or learn more here. And hopefully, if we're doing a really good job of connecting to the right people, generating higher quality leads who end up converting to users at some rate, and it's generating more of them. And so maybe we spend this time today rewriting this, and you see a big boost, or maybe you see something decrease. Hopefully not that, but that will give you some feedback on whether or not we're targeting the right person, whichever one of these two we end up targeting. Now, personally, if I were in your position, I might say, well, because I don't know the answer to this question, I'm just going to copy what the bigger companies already do. And the reason for that is sort of there's a reason that they are there's actually many reasons that they are as successful as they are. And I know that none of these is like a multi-billion-dollar solution right now. I don't think, right?
Yep.
They're not quite that
None of them.
successful just yet, but nonetheless, they have achieved a level of success, and that's not chance. Basically, in startups, and every open source project is a startup in a way, there's so many things that have to go right for you to see any success at all. And so when you look at one of them and you see, oh, well, they've got a lot of logos, they've got a lot of users, they've got a lot of traction, maybe they've raised some money, maybe they're doing significant revenue, you got to think they're doing something right. Probably not just something, probably a lot of things right in order to get to that state. And so my default in cases where I'm not sure is to, and I don't have my own data, which is better. Your own data is better because you're talking to people who are using tail call, and they don't have access to that. And tail call is a bit different than everything else that's surrounding it in this space, Azure and Apollo GraphQL. But that said, um, it is better data than your competitor data. So ultimately, it's your call. I'm happy to go either way.
I think we should stick to backend.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So if we're sticking with backend, let's go ahead and pull up Azure and Apollo GraphQL in new tabs, and we'll refer to them. And let's create a new section in this document that's going to contain Um, it's going to contain copy as well as light layout. So anything we can easily do in Google Docs, we're going to put here. We can use tables for multi-column stuff. This is the stuff we would feed to our web designer.
Okay.
Okay, so what we need here is you can see we talked about levels of detail last time and how like your name is one level of detail, but then you zoom in and you get the phrase, which is it's not even a full sentence. It's the next level of detail, and it describes as a sort of noun with adjectives what this thing is, and that's the headline in Azure. So GraphQL simplified at any scale. That's what this thing is. It has nouns in it, and it has prepositional phrase, and even has a verb, but it represents the first zoom in to what this product is. And then what do they do for Apollo GraphQL? What's their high level phrase to describe it? The API platform for the modern stack. Okay. All right. API platform for the modern stack. Modern stack. I think they're trying to say that this is not a system you integrate into your legacy Spring application, right? I mean,
yeah.
And with that, by the way, they're actually doing something that's common in good marketing, which is to get rid of the people that are not a fit for your solution. You don't just want to pitch your solution as solving all problems, because first off, no one's going to believe that, so you're going to lose credibility. But also, you're going to generate a bunch of people in the top of funnel that are never going to end up converting because you don't meet their needs. So they're just trying to chop off a whole section and saying legacy, no, we're for modern stack. So new greenfield applications or fresh applications that have a lot of flexibility in defining that interface between the end user and the product itself. And then API platform. Where is that? Where do you think that phrase is coming from? What are they trying to get at with that phrase?
So what they say is the main product that they're kind of selling is composition of GraphQL systems. Like you have multiple GraphQL APIs, and you want to compose at a GraphQL layer. So you're not composing APIs anymore. You're composing GraphQL APIs. So you have graphs, and you essentially compose all these graphs to build a bigger graph.
Okay.
So that's why they call themselves as a platform.
So
that's,
a platform as
telemetry,
opposed to a library, like fully featured. You can bring all of your APIs into the system, and okay.
And
It also
telemetry, observability. There's a proper control panel design. So that whole experience of.
It brings to mind, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the old like Apogee or and 3Scale, and basically the very first, I don't know what they're called these days, they were all acquired, but the very first sort of API platforms that said, oh, you company, you enterprise want an API, well, use our front end because we take care of authentication, authorization, rate limiting, tokens, all that stuff. And they were maybe in some ways predecessors of the modern API gateway. Yeah, they were acquired by someone. Amit says something interesting, which is that this one here, Apollo GraphQL, changed their message from last week. I think they're saying
I think
they will help you upgrade.
Oh, okay. Changed the message. Yeah.
Okay.
GraphQL simplified at any scale. Yeah.
And then Cameron Smith mentions a new one I haven't heard of, which is Mesh in guild.dev. Is that close to tail call?
Yes. Yeah.
That one's interesting. Yeah. So this one, go back up to its pitch. It's got a somewhat different pitch, GraphQL Mesh. I think that's an experiment with something new. I think you can see here there's no one way to describe this thing, which indicates it's a relatively new space. GraphQL Mesh versus GraphQL at any scale versus API platform for the modern stack. Like no one really agrees on how something like this should be described. Going back to what we already talked about, the most important features of tail call include what again? What did we say was like the defining characteristic of tail call?
I think it's the DSL and the ability to introspect, right? And once you introspect, we identify a lot of optimizations along the way. And those optimizations give us a lot of performance gain and correctness.
Yes. Okay, so let's go back to where we wrote that down. I think we wrote all of this down somewhere.
I don't
Maybe
think so.
in,
It's not there.
okay. All right. So maybe we just talked about it. Let's just write that down in the new positioning section. What we were looking for here is write down sort of defining characteristics of why tail call is so great and why you should use it. And not the stuff that everyone in this space has, but the stuff that's going to draw you uniquely to tail call. The DSL plus introspectability, and those are really different ways of describing the same thing, right? The DSL is
I would say introspectively, right? Because DSL is
something you have to learn,
primarily,
something that
yeah,
gets in the way.
yeah, yeah. But in a real world scenario, I think these configurations are going to be auto generated.
Yeah.
If you have hundreds of APIs, nobody's going to write this by hand. You
Yes.
use a YAML or a JSON format and just
Yeah.
generate it.
Right. Okay. So, and introspectability, would that be another way to say that everything is data? Is everything just data?
Yep, yep, yep.
And some other terminology that comes to mind here is basically configuration based.
Yes,
It's based on configuration, not coding. Configuration over coding.
yep,
All of these are really getting at this idea that once you define an API using tail call, it's just data all the way down. So you can generate this data from other tools. You can introspect it. What benefits? Because introspectability, it's a feature. Let's translate that into hands-on benefits that someone, especially a back-end engineer, wants. Optimization, you mentioned one of them. So optimization, let's drill down into optimization and say precisely what it gets you. It gets you faster query performance, I assume.
yep.
Faster queries.
Um, Faster queries, also more efficient queries. You don't
Okay.
have duplication. So efficiency is also built into it. Faster
Efficiency.
means, just latency is lower, but efficient could be latency is lower, but also I'm doing less work.
Okay. Let's distill this down even further. Instead of faster queries, let's just say fast. We're making it fast. Um, Efficient. And then what else does introspectability gain you from an optimization standpoint? That's fine if that's it. What are other things that this sort of configuration over code approach gives you?
Correctness.
Correctness. Okay. So this means that because you're not writing code, there can't be bugs. Some notion
Yeah,
along those lines, right?
yeah. You can validate validations, linting is possible. You can apply
Okay.
rules
So
because it's working with
right.
data. You can apply rules.
And validation is a feature. What does it get you? Does it get you fewer
Correctness.
runtime errors?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Does it get you, uh, because probably a lot of these cases are like, okay, you have a runtime. Well, you caught that with a unit test, so it's not really getting you fewer runtime errors. It's meaning you don't have to write tests. I'm trying to really drill down into this. Um,
Security.
Security. Okay. How does it make it more secure? Because you're not writing arbitrary code, right?
Yeah, you're not accessing things that you're not allowed to. You can apply rules to not access or expose things.
Okay, so let's write secure here. And linting, help me understand the practical benefit why should someone care about linting?
Multiple. So, for example, you could have spelling mistakes in your API, but with if you have a configuration-based solution, you could fix that. You could identify the spelling mistake, fix it in the public API, right? You could add lint rules around um, reserving certain keywords.
So is this a quality issue?
Yeah.
Does linting help you improve the quality?
Yep. Yep.
Oh, Amit says introspectability gives compile time checks for performance and security issues. Okay. So yeah, we wrote down secure, performant, right? So maybe maybe instead of that word fast, we more drill into performant, which maybe will resonate with the backend engineer as per Amit's suggestion. Okay, so secure linting improves quality. So let's just write down instead of linting, let's just delete all the features. It's always fun to talk about features of your product, but instead In this exercise, we're just going to talk about benefits to the end user. So the benefit here of linting is that it improves the quality of your API. And I'd even like to be more specific in how it improves the quality or a specific way it improves quality, but I think improved quality is fine for now. And same way for validation. Validation is fewer errors. So let's say, but again, that goes back to my
Should
original
I
thing,
say
which
fewer
is,
runtime errors?
so is that a real problem in for example, use of Apollo GraphQL? Or would those developers who use it and like it and know it just say, well, we write all these unit tests, so we actually have no runtime errors? In other words, is the real benefit of this validation shorter cycle time?
Yeah,
Is it
basically
runtime?
productivity.
Yes.
It's
Is it? It seems to me
if
that
go ahead, go
the,
ahead. Sorry.
the fact that you can't have runtime errors with tail call, whereas you can have runtime errors, which force you to write more unit tests with Apollo GraphQL is a significant distinction to highlight. And the difference is not necessarily in number of runtime errors, because with both approaches, you can produce a solution with no runtime errors. It's really in how much effort is involved. It's really you save time because there's no testing involved. There's no writing unit tests to catch all of these things that would be runtime errors. But if I'm wrong in that, then let me know.
His correctness is just semantic correctness built in.
Yeah.
For example, if there's a type that has a field which can be expanded using an API call, so I have to make an API call to, let's say, expand the content of that type. So let's say user, and I want to get, say, their transaction, and there's an API for that. Now that, because there's an API, that field may or may not be available because the API can fail, right? So that field can never be a required field. It has to be an optional field. And
Yes.
that is some sort of validation that we can build in. That if you have an IO operation on some particular field, it can never be a required field.
Yeah. All right. So this is almost like type safety, right?
Yeah. So the consumer of that API knows that transactions may or may not be available. So the client
Yeah.
code generated will have transactions as an optional field.
Okay. And this is almost the idea of like correct by construction. If you can
Yeah.
construct it, it's correct.
Yeah.
So maybe we just say correct here in a single word, right? And the means by which it is correct is validation. That's fairly broad, though. I'd like to say type safe, but I don't think there'll be a lot of people who don't understand that, probably. What are your thoughts?
I think what we are trying to convey is that the best practices of API orchestration is sort of embedded in the system,
Yeah.
right? So you cannot configure it in a way where and consume it in a way where you'll expect errors. You don't expect errors, and we have errors, right?
Right.
So unexpected errors don't happen because it's so tightly designed.
Yes. I'm trying to think how we would describe that in a single
I
word
think
or
the pitch is
phrase.
the same as like that of an ADT, right? Like, why do we use ADTs to define, um, or why do we use ADT?
Yeah, exactly. It is correct by construction. It's type safe. It is it is valid. But valid really, it's so generic. It doesn't, it's like automatically correct. This thing is, I don't know how to describe this, but here's what I would say. Let's delete validation and fewer runtime errors. I mean, no, actually, I like fewer runtime errors. Could we say, could we almost say like, bug free?
I mean, if you configure it incorrectly, you'll have bugs, right? If
Yes.
you say this is
It's,
a
it's,
user API, but actually returns
it's like
something
a
else,
logic
then
bug versus, yeah. I don't know. Does anyone listening have a suggestion for how we can talk about that? I think it's challenging. I don't think we should put linting there. I think we should delete linting and instead put quality. And also, quality is super vague because an aspect of quality is correctness, right? This correct by construction thing that we're talking about could we say strongly typed? That will make sense to a TypeScript engineer, but probably not make sense to a JavaScript engineer.
If you're targeting backend engineers, then maybe to a Java engineer, to a
Okay,
Golang
that's
engineer.
fair. Yeah. So maybe we say strongly typed here instead of validation, and that implies fewer runtime errors. If we're preaching to the backend audience, then strongly typed takes care of the runtime errors because they already buy that argument. All right, so let's delete the rest. Let's focus on quality here. What do we really mean by quality? Because typing is an aspect of quality. This linting is it's hard to describe that spelling error example that you mentioned. It is very interesting. Let's punt on this for a while. Okay, so introspectability gives us optimization potential and correctness potential. Anything else? I think that's plenty, but if there's more, we should write that down.
Would you consider correctness as reliability?
Reliability. So is the reliability coming from the fact that the user cannot introduce many classes of errors, or is it coming from the fact that all the contributors to tail call are just really good and write unit tests and all that stuff, or is it a mix of both?
Mix of both.
Does it specifically derive from introspectability?
A reasonable amount, right? For example,
Oh,
I don't know if
let's
this
say the
comes under.
reliable instead of quality, right? No, because that's not the spelling example doesn't. But I think you're right. Basically, the strongly typed contributes to reliability.
Yeah.
So maybe instead of strongly typed, we would go up one level and say reliable here. And then we can always zoom into that later and say, these are the reasons why it's reliable. Ash asks, is discoverability an outcome of introspectability?
Discoverability is a feature.
Discoverability is a feature. Like you cannot perform invalid operations on a return field. Yeah, you can't perform invalid that gets back to the sort of strongly typed aspect of this, which contributes to reliability. Yeah, correct, reliable, right? It's
Yeah.
reliable. That's an aspect of that. Uh, I think we're missing one, and that is the introspectable nature of this. Uh, Actually, it's not if you want to say really, it's configuration over code. That's the selling point. And underneath there is introspectability, but also at the same level of introspectability is productivity. Configuration over code, it makes it introspectable, and that leads to optimization and correctness and reliability. But also the fact that it's configuration over code just means you're more productive. Is that right?
It's very interesting because if you look at products like Terraform
Yeah.
is basically doing infrastructure orchestration, and they're saying infrastructure as code, right? So they're essentially pitching the exact opposite of what we are saying. And they think that's what.
That's interesting. And I wonder why that is. Probably because they're trying to get away from infrastructure as point and click in some sort of AWS platform. I don't know what they're trying to avoid with that as code.
Yeah. But they're not saying infrastructure as configuration.
Yeah, that's right. It is though the distinction like data.
What is actually productive? Is it writing code which is more productive, or is it just having configurations more productive?
Trying to avoid YAML. Yeah. Okay, because YAML has a bad rep. Kubernetes has given people newfound hatred of YAML. Okay, so I think we have enough here. Let's take a stab at our highest level pitch, which is a phrase. We know that introspectability is a big thing. We also talked about earlier how you have to be sold on a GraphQL API to use this right now, probably.
Yeah.
Right? We had that conversation. So
Yeah.
that means our phrase might, doesn't have to. You can see that Apollo is not mentioning, right? Apollo is the one that's not mentioning GraphQL. It's not mentioning GraphQL in their phrase pitch. Okay, so what do we want to do?
Apollo, by the way, owns this domain. So
APIs for humans.
the
That
domain
gets,
graphql.com,
oh,
right? That's
wow.
owned by Apollo.
Nice.
It's all Apollo. So
That's,
I think it's kind of clear for anybody who's using GraphQL, they know what Apollo is.
yes.
Most cases.
Yeah.
That's not true for Hasura, by the way. I mean, people know about Hasura, but Hasura has to explicitly say.
Yeah. Okay, so we have too many keywords here. We need to simplify this down a bit. And we need to also decide, is GraphQL platform the way we want to pitch it? I don't think that's bad. I think it's choice. One of them is saying GraphQL simplified. The other one is saying API platform.
We could also do something like, I don't know if this works, like uh, the Nginx for GraphQL, or you know, Vercel for GraphQL. Vercel is pretty um, popular for front-end applications. Something off.
If we're pitching back-end engineers, it needs to be I think Nginx would be more familiar to the back-end engineer.
Yeah. Yeah.
We could try Nginx. Oh, that raises an interesting question. How does Nginx pitch itself?
There should be some.
I think it was that first link.
Yeah, this one.
This is the problem with something that's so big that they don't need to pitch themselves anymore.
Yeah.
It's like if you went to MySQL, it probably wouldn't have a pitch, or Postgres probably wouldn't have a pitch. They're too successful. See, they don't have a pitch. Or MySQL, we don't need a pitch.
This is a good place to be in. Like,
yes,
at least building the website becomes so easy.
right. When you can afford to be this lazy about it. Okay, so the Nginx for GraphQL. I don't know. What do folks in the audience think? Would you get that pitch? The Nginx for GraphQL. Any feedback on that? Could we say, I know this almost moves us into a different category, but like if we're really saying that introspectability is a key defining point of tail call, could we like say something along the lines of code-free GraphQL?
Like a no-code GraphQL, right?
Yeah. Or is that moving us too much into a different space?
Yeah. I mean, no-code solutions. I don't know if that's the right positioning.
Yeah.
It feels like a SaaS product for something, no code.
Yeah. Right.
But not an engineering dev tool.
Yeah.
This is hard.
It is hard. You can see in your existing pitch, you are using GraphQL platform, so you're locked into GraphQL, which we said might be a good thing to eliminate people who aren't interested in that. But also, it might be a challenging thing because there might be a lot of users out there who really should be using tail call and would be using it if they knew how simple you're making performant GraphQL. That's where I think the Apollo pitch is coming from, perhaps. They do mention GraphQL in their sentence long pitch, but they don't mention it in their phrase, just API platform. API platform is super generic. And for the modern stack, they really are saying this is how we do it these days, which heads off criticism of why GraphQL. Why GraphQL? Well, that's just the way we do it these days. We're not in 1990. We don't do REST APIs anymore. We do GraphQL APIs. This is for modern stacks. I think we could do API platform or GraphQL platform. And the other one is GraphQL mesh, which I think they're trying to call on this idea of federation, interconnection, like forming a mesh. What do you like?
I don't think that's very opinionated and just one sort of product, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like basically you're saying you already have GraphQL and now
Yeah.
you want to sort of compose it together.
Yeah. So I would say my favorites are GraphQL platform with some modifiers and API platform. Both of them, I think, get at what tail call is, leaving some room for us to do a better job explaining that in a single sentence.
I actually, changed this piece, which earlier, if you remember, talked about traditional gateways. Yeah. And I've removed it because it confuses more people. So we've changed this text.
Compositional could be an interesting word. An interesting word to use in marketing, compositional GraphQL. Is there any aspect of introspectability that contributes to compositionality?
I guess, yes.
Let's list that under introspectability then, just compositionality. Amit says, should we take inspiration from Kubernetes website? They orchestrate services and tail call orchestrates APIs. I think we could go down that path. I think we could say API orchestrator for GraphQL or something like that. That's a confusing pitch. There's multiple ways to interpret that sentence, but this idea that fundamentally tail call is an API orchestrator
That's what we do right now.
in the sentence,
API or
right?
yeah.
I'm just thinking about the phrase. Could it be like API orchestrator for GraphQL, or could it be, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that phrase pitch? We could also more start in the sentence pitch, and then backtrack. Maybe we should do that. If you don't
Give
have an
me
immediate thought
give me
on,
at least one version. Let me play through my mind.
yeah.
Say what do you have in mind? And
So API orchestrator for GraphQL, um, something involving GraphQL platform, which would be a variation on the theme you have here, or something involving API platform.
I want to stay away from the word platform in general. An API
Yeah.
platform becomes a little too vague because when you say platform, people don't get what does
Yeah.
that mean really.
Yeah. Okay, here's
It's
another
more
way we can approach this phrase based pitch is we can tell people what it allows them to do. Instead of describing the solution, we describe what the solution helps them do. And then we describe the solution in our sentence pitch. So an example could be like deploy uh, fast GraphQL APIs or something like that, because that tells you what a solution is by telling you what you can do with it. What are your thoughts
or
on something
something
like
like
that?
don't don't write GraphQL by hand. Stop.
Okay, I like it. So stop writing GraphQL by hand. Is there a way that we could phrase that in the positive?
We could use ChatGPT. That's the
We could do what?
if you want. We could use ChatGPT to convert it to a
To the positive? Yes, let's try
yeah.
that. I think I'll come up with something like, automatic GraphQL or something like that, probably. And also, writing GraphQL by hand sounds like GraphQL queries. Stop
Mm.
writing GraphQL queries by hand, which would be like a pitch for a front end engineer for a query builder.
You mean stop writing GraphQL backend,
Yeah,
or how about
yeah.
automate GraphQL backends? GraphQL backends.
Maybe automatic. Um, is that correct? Or
Yeah,
should it be like you automate it? You use tail call to automate it.
automatic is
That's
more
veering into the
appropriate.
sort of no code territory. But I do like
Yeah.
I like this idea of stop writing by hand. Stop writing it by hand. In fact, we could do that. I normally don't like to uh, state things in the negative, but it sometimes is useful. So let's try that. Let's try one of or both of these in the new layout. We're either going to have automatic GraphQL backends or automate GraphQL backends or stop writing GraphQL backends by hand. Let's put it on the new layout though, because we're trying to form
Oh, sorry. Yep.
just one of them. Let's just pick one. You can leave all of the variations above, but the new layout basically we want this to be what we send to the web designer. Okay, and let's not make it bullet. In fact, let's center it like it is on the website. Okay, now our one sentence pitch for this, which also has to reinforce this notion that you're not going to be writing your GraphQL backends by hand. So if you're not going to be writing your GraphQL backends by hand, how are you going to be writing them? Basically, our phrase here, our single phrase pitch for tail call, is forcing this next level to be constrained in a certain way because we have to explain how it is you're getting your GraphQL backend if you're not writing them by hand. And then suggest get your GraphQL backend automated. Amit suggests, are you still writing GraphQL by hand? I like that because it can be shortened. You could say still writing GraphQL backends by hand. It's a little long, but it kind of gets your attention if you happen to be in that target market. Try it with
It's a little too markety, like doesn't
right,
come off as a
right. And we want to avoid selling too much
yeah,
selling because
yeah,
of
yeah.
how much developers love salespeople. Okay, stop writing GraphQL backend. Add an S there. I think we need an S at the end. So now here's this next pitch. Our sentence pitch is going to talk about how you uh, use simple configuration Is that how we want to describe it? We
How
want to get
about
at this aspect of configuration over code or pure data or introspectability. We could say DSL, but then the first thing I think about when I hear DSL is I have to learn a new language embedded in some other language.
yeah,
They are GraphQL. Are they called directives? What are they
yeah,
called?
um, yeah. These are directives. These are types. These are fields.
I think we want to give people a real short taste of how they automate it. How about this push button? See, that's super long. uh, but like this notion of like push button GraphQL backends that are even if we're stuck on this part, let's write down some of the things we want to say about tail call. So we can choose from that little list up there. I think we want to say performant or scalable in there. We want to say secure for sure. What else do we want to say?
Robust, reliable.
Yeah, I think reliable is good. I think those capture most of it. Right. Okay. So here's what I'm thinking. Don't take this literally because it's not great, but it's like using GraphQL directives. Tail call lets you launch performant, secure, reliable APIs in days, not months or something like that.
Using GraphQL directives might be
It's too low
just talking
level.
about the, yeah, yeah.
Um,
I just
that's why I
thought about
wanted
one
like,
thing.
go ahead.
So we've talked about, configuration over code and what it brings us. One of the other things which is a key differentiator for Tailcall is the architecture. It makes it very versatile and makes it a very versatile product. So you can
Yes.
use it as a gateway in front of multiple GraphQL
Yeah.
services. You could deploy it as a sidecar because it's very lightweight and expose your
Yes.
REST APIs as a GraphQL. And so you could use it in different ways to kind of solve different uh, category of problems, and that's primarily because of the architecture and it's not just the DSL, but the way it sort of works.
Yes. So we're missing an aspect here of flexibility or versatility. So I would add that
Yeah,
to our list. I don't think we want to lead with that because it's too hard to explain that. But I do think that that leads to a point later down lower where we talk about that versatility and flexibility and some of the things that it buys you. Oh, okay, so how about something more along the lines of, uh, how about this? Because right now the way it's working is you add directives to your GraphQL schema, right? And some other stuff on the side. But like go from go from schema to performance, secure, reliable GraphQL API in minutes, days, hours. This notion that tail call allows you to go from the schema, which just represents what you want to have exist. It's your vision for what should exist, to something that works and implements that in a performance, secure, and reliable fashion very, very quickly.
but when you say schema, you mean this thing, right?
Yes.
Shouldn't we say go uh, from the schema of your existing data source? Like why care about this DSL? It's going to be auto generated anyways, right?
Okay. Um, do you have tooling to generate that now?
Working on it.
Okay. Um, so
Some of
so
it
the
exists, some of it is getting better.
and that tooling will work on open API and other sort of things that a company
Yeah.
has. And
Open
will
API, Postman collections, all those kind of things.
and there's multiple choices of what GraphQL API should exist on top of that.
Yes.
So how are you handling the disambiguation part?
If we know the shape of uh, the endpoint, the data source,
Yeah.
the way we can communicate with it, for us, it's in every data source is like an RPC call.
Yeah.
And if it's an RPC call, we just have to figure out the right parameters to call it. If we know
Yeah.
and just connect it with other RPC calls,
But
that
what
sort
what
of
I'm
sits
getting
on
at
top of it.
is that it seems like a business a company and a backend engineer would want to control what the GraphQL API looks like. They're going to want to say it should look like this and not like this.
Yes.
It's like, why companies use OpenAPI and Smithy and other tools like that. It's a protobuf because they want to say it needs to look exactly like this, and then everyone is going to end up using exactly this. So that's this notion of spec first. So maybe we can ignore the GraphQL schema stuff and just say go from spec to world-class GraphQL backend in days without coding or in hours without coding or something like that, getting at this notion that even if you're not going to be writing the schema by hand, the business or the backend engineer, platform engineer has some spec written down probably for how this thing should work and what it should look like. And Tailcall is helping you transform that, maybe somewhat automatically or with assistance from OpenAPI and other sources of APIs that it's orchestrating. But fundamentally, there is probably this notion of spec that exists that has to be materialized into something that actually works.
So generally the first version of the configuration that's generated might not be the best,
Yeah.
right? And what you could do is you could take the first version of the configuration and then apply these transformations on top of it and make it better.
Yeah.
Clean it up.
Yeah.
That's something which introspectability sort of gives us. It gives us that
Yes.
ability to transform those
Tooling friendly.
configurations.
That's why I've argued for years that build tools should use data for describing the build, because even though it's not perfect, it is introspectable, which means it's tooling friendly. Okay, so does that mean you don't like this notion of I guess see, it might just be me, but the bigger company you go with, the more they are to start with a spec first approach, rather than a code first. Basically, if you told this is just my opinion, I might be wrong here, but if you told a big company, I have this tool which is going to automatically give you a GraphQL API with you pushing a button. You just give it sources of input, you push a button, you get out a GraphQL API. They'll be like, what? No, I want to decide what that GraphQL API should look like in advance with input from multiple teams, have a spec for that, and then I want to implement that. And if you can provide tooling that helps me materialize this GraphQL API that I want, then great. But I don't want to have no control over the process. But I might be wrong. If I am wrong, then definitely that pitch of like you feed in APIs and you get a GraphQL API on top of them that aggregates them, I think is a good one. It just comes down to, like in my experience, small teams want code first and big teams want spec first. And they don't see each other's worlds. The code first people are like, why would you ever want that? The spec first people are like, why would you ever want that? Because they have different problems at different levels of scale, especially when you have multiple teams all relying on the same artifact, GraphQL schema or whatever, to build the clients and servers and whatnot. It can become useful to make the design of that API intentional. What are your thoughts on that?
Good point. Yeah, I agree. I agree because one of the other things with this is when you have, even if you're a large organization, onboarding can take insane amount of time. You've got thousands of APIs.
Yeah.
And if you want to like hand pick each API and then customize and then insert it into this configuration, it can take massive amounts of time. So some sort of tooling needs to be there, but at the same time, they want to control the schema.
Yeah. And Adrian provides a data point, which is, in his experience, big companies prefer the spec first approach.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to this notion that there is a spec somewhere. Maybe it's only a rough idea of what this thing should look like. How about this idea that you bring the spec, we bring the back end, we bring the GraphQL back end.
Yeah. So you design it, we build it, essentially.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. You design, we build. I like that. So our pitch could almost be um, using tail call, you can rapidly turn your design into a performance secure, reliable GraphQL backend. So like maybe our sentence pitch could be turn, it's obvious we're using tail call, turn your design, it could be spec, it could also be design into, and it should be rapidly. Like this is something that happens really fast, quickly. Turn your design into a performance secure, reliable GraphQL backend. And I think we can play with this to make it a little more interesting. It has a lot of uniformity here, which makes it a little bit dry, but I think this is pretty promising. You
What
need a
kind of
comma
design are we
after
talking
performant.
about? Which design are we talking about?
It,
Yeah,
it's
we gotta be a little more specific, I think.
it could be spec or it could be API design. It's a design for an API. Turn your API design, or turn your design for an API, or turn your API spec. I think is a little bit a matter of personal preference. Turn your API spec into a performant, secure, reliable GraphQL backend. And then let's keep adding to the end of this. We can change the sentence structure, but we're missing some idea here, which is that this backend is aggregated across existing APIs, right? It's yeah, built atop existing data sources and APIs, and then maybe let's add
But turn your ideal spec.
yeah, even if you want to make it a little bit more marketing, turn your dream API. This is your dream API.
That's a little too much.
I love marketing. What can I say? Turn your ideal API spec into a performant, secure, reliable GraphQL backend built atop existing data sources and APIs. How about I like to have too much and then sort of chop it up and make it easier to understand. But how about we would say quickly turn or rapidly? What do you think about adding that word in there? Aside from this being a little bit, Amit suggests instantly, which I like, but again, I like marketing, so instantly turn your ideal API spec. That might be
Rapidly.
a little
Yeah.
high. The dial's turned a little too high on that one, maybe. It's too juicy. Okay, so rapidly turn your ideal API spec into a performance secure, reliable GraphQL backend built atop existing data sources and APIs. What do you think?
Yeah.
And we can chop this up, we can rearrange it, we can simplify the sentence structure, but this feels right to me. I mean, it feels like in the ballpark. It's like within 10 to 20% of something that gathers
Mm.
all of our feedback and our learning from these other sites into something that's unique to GraphQL.
This would be the first VH1.
Yeah,
You have to make it a little more concise.
yeah, I agree. Well, no, uh, the header one over there on the right,
Mhm.
GraphQL platform engineered for scale, that is actually stop writing GraphQL backends. Should it be developing? No, because you're still in a way developing.
Should we say by hand?
I love it, but
Stop
then it's
writing.
getting a bit big for that single phrase pitch. I love by hand.
Oh, handwriting? No.
Yeah, because that's handwriting is a noun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hmm. Maybe just add by hand because we want to preserve. If we're not able to shorten it, we're not going to be able to shorten this in this session. We still want to preserve that notion so we remember it later on. I think I like this. I like this pitch quite a lot. Stop writing these things by hand. Turn your spec into something that's world class and best practices compliant. That can sort of aggregate across all of your existing APIs. It's your ideal spec. There's a lot of really good things in this. I think this one needs
We've not.
tweaking.
Yeah. Best practices is an important thing because that's a steep learning curve for any technology to build
Yeah.
best practices into it.
I think we need to build on that. I think this is our core elevator pitch for
Yeah.
the big splash, the hero screen here. And then what we do is we drill deep into that best practices part by covering about how it, you know, in a way, there was a blog post published recently on how GraphQL sucks and I'm never using it again.
Yeah.
You know that? Yes.
Yeah.
So we should go through there and we
Yeah.
should pick out all of the reasons why GraphQL sucks and we should move them over into tail call and be like reasons why tail call is awesome, why GraphQL
Yeah.
is great. So I think that's a great source of feedback for tail call. All these negative articles on GraphQL because you can be like, well, problem solved. That's what we deliver to you in this open source. All
Awesome.
right, so I
I'll
think
make a note of this.
I think we're about out of time. But if you would send me that copy there, or just
Mhm.
reshare the article, and I'll see if there's a small tweaks we could do to that basic pitch. But I think it's really great. I think this is a winning pitch here, and now we just need to flesh it out in some features, and some more content on that homepage to show people what it looks like and why you should consider using tail call. All right,
Awesome.
thanks a lot, Tushar. See you later.
Thank you,
Have a great
John.
weekend. Bye bye.
Bye bye.